right, welcome to the first lecture of the spring semester, chapter 14, the digestive system and body metabolism. Now, if you remember from unit 1 back in the fall semester, we learned most of the anatomy that we're going to need in this unit. We know what the stomach looks like, we know where it's located, we know where the liver's at, we know the gallbladder, the large intestine, small intestine. Now, this unit, all you got to do is just get the physiology. So the pancreas, we know what it looks like, where it's located. What does it do? What hormones does it produce? What digestive enzymes does it produce? What are the different cells in the stomach? So a lot of the anatomy we already know. So this unit shouldn't be too difficult. I know unit 1 was, a long time ago, back in August and September, but now we're just going to be focusing more on the physiology of the digestive system. All right, so here we go. And we have learning objective number 1. So at the end of, I don't know about this lecture, but at the end of like lecture number 2, you should be able to name the organs of what's called the alimentary canal. Another name for the alimentary canal is the gastrointestinal tract, or the GI tract. It's basically the route that food takes, when you take food in, goes through the alimentary canal or the gastrointestinal tract, and then it comes out eventually. When it's done, comes out the anus. So that's from mouth to the anus. That's the entire gastrointestinal tract. And the accessory organs. So there's accessory organs along the way that help out in digestion. So accessory organs of the digestive system, and identify each on an appropriate model or diagram. So it says nothing about function. So this, beginning part of this unit is going to be more of the anatomy, be able to identify the different organs in the alimentary canal and also the accessory organs or the accessory structures. All right, so what is the digestive system? I think you probably know this part. Very simple definition. It's the body system responsible for digestion. Hey, digestive system, digestion. And digestion is the breakdown of food and the absorptions of the nutrients. So basically, like say you eat a piece of bread, that's called ingestion. It's not called eating. You ingest food, you ingest it. Well, that big piece of bread is not ready to enter your bloodstream, and it's certainly not ready to enter your each individual cells. It needs to be broken down in its components. So bread is made of starch. So you begin the digestive process in the mouth with your teeth, and you chew on the food. That's going to break it down. But it's just breaking it down into like small little pieces of bread. It also mixes with your saliva. Now it's a ball of chewed bread. That's called a bolus. We'll go over that later. And it's going to go down. It's going to get broken down further. It goes to your stomach, and it's going to go into your intestines. And now it's going to break it down into its molecular components. It's going to break it down into the starch. But that's still too big. And it's going to then the enzymes in your intestines is going to break that starch down into its components of sugars, and then finally into the simple sugars of glucose. And now it's been broken down small enough in order to it to travel through the bloodstream and actually enter the cells as glucose sugar. And now the body can use it for energy. So that's the digestive system, breaking down the food you eat, making it small enough in order to enter each of your cells and to be used to make energy. And now the gastrointestinal tract, the GI tract, versus the accessory organs. All right, so the GI tract, alimentary canal, is a continuous coiled muscular tube that carries out the processes of breaking down food, digestion. Remember, ingestion is taking in food through the mouth. Digestion, that's the process of breaking it down in smaller and smaller and smaller until you get it to its molecular components. Absorption is the process of absorbing those small, like amino acids or simple sugars, absorbing it into your bloodstream. And then defecation, I think you know what that is. That's the elimination of waste out the anus. All right, so here's the path it takes. The mouth ingests food in the mouth. Pharynx, it's kind of like the back of your throat that's going to end up going down the esophagus. The larynx is the top of the trachea. The pharynx is like you get your nasopharynx. So, like if you're going to hawk up a loogie, you go like that's your nasopharynx. Like the back of your throat, that would be the oropharynx. And then below the oropharynx, just before it goes in the esophagus, I call it the hypopharynx, but it's also called the laryngopharynx for larynx, laryngopharynx. So anyways, pharynx, that's just below the mouth, but it's also the nasopharynx is above the mouth. Then it goes into the food tube, the esophagus. Then it goes into the stomach. goes through the lower esophageal sphincter or the cardiac sphincter. And then it's going to go into the small intestines through the pyloric sphincter. That's the sphincter between the stomach and the small intestine. We'll go over it. And remember the three parts of the small intestine: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. Duodenum is the smallest. Jejunum is where most absorption occurs in the jejunum. Ileum is the longest. And then we go into the large intestines. Remember, that goes around the small intestines. And remember, the parts of the large intestine, also called the colon, you have the cecum. So that's where, when it goes from the small intestine to the large intestine, the last part of the small intestine is the ileum. The first part of the large intestine is the cecum. So that little valve between the small and large intestine is called the ileocecal valve. Ileum, cecum. So cecum's first, and the food goes up. Whenever you're going up, whether you're in an airplane or whatever, you're ascending. So the food's going up, ascending colon. Then it goes sideways, horizontally. Remember, mid-sagittal cut, whenever you cut something like this, it's transverse. So that's the transverse colon. So ascending when it's going up, transverse when it's going horizontally, and then it's going to go down. The food's going to go down in the large intestine. Whenever you're going down in an airplane, you're descending. So that's the descending colon. And then when it turns medial or towards the middle, that's the sigmoid. And when it goes down or inferior, that's going to be the rectum. And then eventually, when the food is done, all the nutrients is basically spent. This is basically the stuff that you could not digest, and it comes out the anus. So if stretched from end to end, it would reach about 30 feet. And most of that is going to be in this right here. Vast majority of that 30 feet is going to be in the small intestines. And that's in a cadaver, which is a dead body, a corpse, due to no muscle tone. Not going to need to know that. All right, so that's the gastrointestinal tract. All this is where food directly travels through. Guess what? Food goes into your mouth. It goes into your pharynx. It goes in through your esophagus. It goes into your stomach, into the small intestines. Food travels through all of these. Now, that's the difference. In accessory digestive organs, they aid in digestion, but the food is not actually traveling through them. So these are organs that contribute to digestive processes, but they don't. But food does not directly pass through them. Teeth, your food goes right by your teeth, but food doesn't go inside your teeth. You use them for mastication. That's a word for chewing, mastication. So the aid in digestion, your tongue, it moves the food around and assists in swallowing. Swallowing is called deglutition. We'll go over that. Salivary glands, food doesn't go through them, but salivary glands produce saliva, which both moistens your food, and it also contains enzymes like salivary amylase. Salivary amylase in your mouth starts to break up carbohydrates, starch, and break it down into sugar. So that's chemical digestion, because it's using a chemical, an enzyme, to break down the food into smaller parts. The pancreas, food doesn't go through it, but the pancreas secretes several digestive enzymes that helps to digest fats, carbohydrates, and also proteins. The liver, food doesn't go through it, but the liver produces bile. Bile gets transported to the gallbladder, which stores the bile. It gets released into the duodenum of the small intestine, and that helps to emulsify or help to break down fats or lipids. And in the gallbladder, I said that. So the liver makes the bile. It's also called gall. It used to be called gall. That's why it's called the gallbladder. And the gallbladder stores the bile, and then it's going to release that into the duodenum, and that's going to help to break down or emulsify fats or lipids. And here's a little diagram of the digestive system. All right, so remember, food gets ingested, ingestion through the mouth. You're going to use your teeth. That's an accessory structure to masticate, mastication, chew it, chew the food to break it down into smaller little pieces. Here are your salivary glands, your sublingual because it's below your tongue, submandibular because it's below your mandible, and here's your parotid salivary glands that release saliva, which helps to moisten the food, which is once you chew it and it mixes with saliva, now it's no longer food. Now it's called a bolus, bolus. So it's going to go in your oral cavity, gets mixed with the saliva. That's going to go down the esophagus, past the upper esophageal sphincter. It's going to be moved what's peristalsis. So you can even be standing on your head. You can stand on your head. That food's still going to go down because peristalsis is wave-like muscle contractions in your esophagus that actually pushes the food down your esophagus. So like I said, you can stand on your head. It's not, gravity's not going to make it go back up. It's still going to go down through peristalsis. Doesn't go through the liver, but travels by the liver. past the lower esophageal or cardiac sphincter, and then into the stomach. And then once the bolus, remember a chewed ball of food and saliva mixed together is called a bolus. Once it reaches the stomach, it's going to be mixed. There's cells in the stomach called chief cells. They excrete what's called pepsinogen, which is inactive enzyme. And then you have other cells called parietal cells. They release hydrochloric acid. When the hydrochloric acid, HCl, mixes with the pepsinogen, it turns into the active enzyme, which is called pepsin. And pepsin helps to break down all the proteins that you eat. So the food's going to get sloshed around by the muscularis layer. We're going to go over that later. So it's going to be muscle contractions. It's going to mix the food all around. The food will then exit through the pyloric sphincter, which is the boundary between the stomach and the duodenum. It's like a little valve that opens and closes. So when a hormone is released called gastrin, it opens up the pyloric sphincter, which allows food to exit the stomach and enter the duodenum, the first part of the small intestine. Now it's no longer a bolus. Once it's traveled through the stomach, now it's like a slimy, kind of a slurry, kind of like a milkshake, and now it's called chyme, Chyme. Now, once the chyme, Chyme, enters the duodenum, the first part of the small intestine, the duodenum is going to release some hormones. One of them is called cholecystokinin, or CCK, and it also releases a hormone called secretin. Both those together, the CCK is what stimulates the gallbladder, an accessory organ, to release the bile into the duodenum. Remember, the bile is what's going to emulsify or help to break down fats or lipids. The secretin is going to stimulate the pancreas right here, another accessory structure, accessory organ. It's going to cause it to release bicarbonate into the duodenum because this chyme is highly acidic. It's full of hydrochloric acid. Without bicarbonate, it's going to be too acidic. It's going to burn a hole through your small intestine. So that bicarbonate neutralizes the acid. And it also helps or initiates the pancreas to secrete its digestive enzymes. It's got three that helps to break down proteins: trypsin, chymotrypsin, and carboxypeptidase. You going to remember those in 30 seconds? No. But at the end of this unit, hopefully you'll know them. It also secretes pancreatic amylase. That's to help to break down carbohydrates, like starch. It also secretes pancreatic lipase. I say lipase, some people say lipase. I like lipase better because it breaks down lipids or fats. After the chyme, Chyme, exits the duodenum, it's going to enter the second part of the small intestine called the jejunum, which is basically all of this region up in here, the top part of the small intestine. I don't know exactly where it ends. This is the jejunum. And there's no sphincter between the duodenum and the jejunum. So there's no little valve that opens and closes, at least none that I'm aware of. And then following the jejunum, it's going to enter the ileum, the last part of the small intestine, which is basically the bottom part. So it's going to go through here. Now, this food is not only is it move through peristalsis, wave-like muscle movements that keeps it moving. There's also wave-like movements within the small intestine called segmentation. And that's where it kind of makes it go back and forth, to kind of slosh it together. And it also makes it stay there long enough so that all the nutrients can be absorbed. So peristalsis is the wave-like contractions that keeps food moving along through the GI or gastrointestinal tract, where segmentation is like movements that kind of get it to slosh back and forth for a while. So it makes it stay there longer so more nutrients can be absorbed. And remember, when it's going to enter the large intestine, the last part is the ileum of the small intestine. The first part of the large intestine is the cecum. So it's going to go through the ileocecal valve right here to enter the cecum, the first part of the large intestine. Now, since the food or chyme has traveled the entire length of the small intestine, greater than 90% of absorption and digestion has occurred. So now it's entering the large intestine. This is basically just preparing it, preparing the feces to exit the body through the anus. So remember, it goes into the cecum. So this is very little digestion and absorption is occurring here. Over 90% of it occurs in the small intestine. So then there's the cecum. Remember, it's going up: ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, sigmoid colon, and rectum. And some organs of the mouth and oral cavity. So labia, those are the lips. Hard palate. So if you use your tongue and you kind of poke the front part of the roof of your mouth, it's going to feel hard because there's a bone there, the palatine bone and the maxilla bone, which makes up the hard palate. Now, if you poke your tongue a little further back, it's going to feel soft. That's the soft palate. And you also have this little thing where if you go it's like a little boxing, a little punching bag. You can see it right here. That's called the uvula. Everybody's seen that. And that's for when you swallow. Well, first you mastication, chewing, using your teeth, mix it with saliva. It's now a bolus. When you swallow it, which is called deglutition, not swallowing now, it's deglutition. The uvula is going to swing up and it's going to block the oropharynx. So it's going to keep food or drink from going up into your come out your nose. It's going to make it go down and into your esophagus. It's not shown here. Well, it's shown here, but it's not listed here. Remember, we also have the epiglottis right here. So when during deglutition, swallowing, this is going to flap. This is going to swing down. It's going to cover the trachea. So food doesn't go down your windpipe, your trachea into your lungs. It's going to do no good there. So it forces the food to go down the esophagus and towards the stomach. All right, so now the four tissue layers that make up the gastrointestinal tract or GI tract. Remember, that's also called the alimentary canal. All right, so we're going to start on the very inside. There's this space here called the lumen. That's where the food is going to travel through. Remember, when you ingest food, ingestion, you put food in your mouth, you chew it up, you mix it with saliva. Once you swallow it, that's now called a bolus. And that bolus, once it exits the stomach, now it's no longer a bolus, now it's called chyme. So the food or the chyme or the bolus is going to travel through this tube called the lumen. And then we're going to be moving out. So the first layer you're going to get to that lines the lumen is called the mucosa or the mucosal layer. You can see it's made of three distinct layers. It's got a layer of cells on the very inside lining the lumen. And it's got a layer of connective tissue. And it's got a layer of muscle fibers around that. So that's called the mucosa or the mucosal layer. All right, now moving further away from the space, the lumen, you're going to reach what's called the submucosal layer, a band of connective tissue right here. Go over it in more detail in another slide. Continue to move out, you're going to get the muscularis layer. This one right here, this part of the GI tract has two layers. So it's got a circular band of muscles going this way. So it goes like around, could be like the small intestines. It also has a longitudinal band just on top of that, and that's going to go the same direction that the gastrointestinal or GI tract is moving. Now, I know this isn't the stomach because the stomach's going to have three different layers of muscles. It's got a circular layer, it's got a longitudinal layer, but what makes it different, it's also got an oblique layer that runs like diagonally to the direction of the way the food is moving. And I just noticed something. So this obviously isn't the stomach because it's got only two bands of muscles, circular and longitudinal. But there is something in here that tells me exactly where in the GI tract this is. And it's this word right here, mesentery. Remember, the mesentery is the tissue that binds together the small intestines. So we know this is a region of the small intestine right here. All right, so now moving out from the muscularis layer, we're going to come to the serosa layer, which is a layer of connective tissue. And then on top of that has a layer of epithelial cells it's also called the mesothelium. Now you can see right here that this layer of cells, it's also the visceral peritoneum. Remember, the peritoneum is the tissue layers that surround all your abdominal organs. And so this right here would be the visceral peritoneum. And then outside of that, you have the parietal peritoneum. And in between those, you have the peritoneal space or cavity. And these cells right here, so like this would be like the parietal peritoneum on the outside. This is the visceral peritoneum here. And between that is the space. And these cells right here are going to release serous fluid, a very slippery fluid. And that's going to prevent friction when your GI tract organs are moving around. All right, so some more in-depth info on the mucosa, the first layer that you encounter when you move out from the lumen. So it's the innermost layer that actually lines the lumen of whatever organ it is, esophagus, stomach. In this case, it's the small intestines because it's got the mesentery. Also contains lymph tissue that fights pathogens. Lymph tissue is part of your immune system. So it has three distinct layers. The most innermost layer next to the lumen is made of epithelium or epithelial cells. Your skin cells are epithelial cells. So all the cells that line the outside of your body, and they also line the cavities of the inside of your body, like inside of your mouth, those are epithelial cells. We got two types here. We got first what's called stratified squamous. If you really, really did a good job in the summer assignment, maybe remember that. I doubt it, but maybe you've heard of it. Stratified means there's several layers. It's cells upon cells upon cells upon cells. Squamous is a specific type of cell that's kind of like flat. So stratified squamous is a stack of a bunch of flat cells, one on top of another. So stratified means layers. Squamous means they're flat. The other type is simple columnar. Simple means it's not multiple layers of cells on top of each other. It means it's just one layer. And columnar means it's kind of got a shape, kind of like a column. And then some of these guys have little hairs on the top, what are called cilia. So these would be ciliated, simple columnar cells. All right, so these columnar cells, simple columnar, only has one layer, doesn't have a bunch of different layers. Their jobs, they secrete enzymes, so they're going to release enzymes, which helps to break down the food. Chemical digestion, there's mechanical digestion like mastication, chewing, that's mechanical. And then enzymes are part of chemical digestion, breaking down food using chemicals. So these guys release enzymes, so they release stuff, but they also absorb stuff. So they're also taking in the nutrients, and then those nutrients are going to enter the bloodstream. And now, lining the walls of the intestines, you have these specialized epithelial cells called goblet cells. Their job is they secrete mucus. They secrete mucus into the lumen, and that mucus helps to lubricate and protect the cells, as the food is passing through. All right, so the next layer of the mucosa layer is right here. It's loose connective tissue. It's called the lamina propria. Connective tissue between the epithelial cells and then the outermost layer of the mucosa called the muscularis mucosae, which is a thin layer of smooth muscle. And its main job is it creates it creates folds in this epithelial layer that lines the lumen. So instead of it being totally smooth, where the food's just passing through, it's like if it goes this distance, it's got very little surface area to absorb the nutrients. But if it's folded like this, now the food has all this surface area. There's a lot more cells. They're able to absorb those nutrients from the food and then put it in the bloodstream. All right, so now moving out from the lumen, the next layer, the submucosa layer, once again, it's right here, made of connective tissue, specifically areolar, loose connective tissue. You might need to know it's made of connective tissue. You certainly ain't gonna need to know it's areolar. So it's between the muscularis mucosae and the muscularis layer out here. It contains blood vessels, glands, and lymphatic tissue. Remember, lymphatic tissue, that's part of your immune system, fights pathogens. The neurons here are part of what's called the enteric nervous system. Enteric nervous system controls digestion. They call it the brain of the gut. So all the things that's happening in your digestive system is basically happening without much help from the brain. So the muscle contractions, all the release of chemicals, acids, enzymes, that's all controlled by the neurons inside the gastrointestinal tract. All right, so functions of the submucosa, it helps to regulate movements of smooth muscle. So remember, the rhythmic muscle contractions or movements, which keeps food moving through the GI tract. That's called peristalsis. Now, inside the small intestines, you also have movements that gets the food to go kind of back and forth in the same region for just a little while. And that's called segmentation. Getting it to move back and forth helps to mix it. It also makes it stay there longer, which aids in digestion and also aids in absorption of the nutrients. Blood and lymph vessels are going to absorb the tiny little food molecules. So once your food is, you eat something, say you eat a steak, it's got protein, it's got fat. It's going to break the protein, chop it up mechanically and chemically into its components, which are amino acids. And now those amino acids can be absorbed into the bloodstream, and the fats are going to get broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. And now those can be absorbed in your lymph vessels. Carbohydrates, like if you eat chips or a potato, those get chopped down into simple sugars, like say like glucose. And all those small little tiny little molecules that got broken down, now they can be absorbed into the blood and or lymph vessels. All right, moving out from the submucosa, you got the muscularis layer right here. Some of it's made of skeletal muscle, which is under your voluntary control, so you can't control it. So obviously the muscles in your mouth, the pharynx, which is like the back of your throat, the upper third of the esophagus is under your voluntary control, and also the anal sphincter. So it's function control over swallowing and also eliminating waste in a process called defecation. Most of your GI tract, though, is smooth muscle, which is involuntary, so it happens all by itself. So remember, in this case, it's the mesentery, so we know this is a little segment of the small intestine. So in this one, it's got inner circular fibers that go around it, and it's also got longitudinal muscle fibers that run the same direction that the small intestine is going. Also, remember the stomach's got three layers. So it's got the circular, it's got the longitudinal, but it's also got oblique that runs diagonally. And the function of this layer is to mix, crush, and propel the food along in a process called peristalsis. So the movement of food through the GI tract is moved through by peristalsis. But it also helps in digestion by mixing the food with enzymes or acid, and also by mechanically crushing it. And finally, the last layer of the GI tract, most outside, furthest away from the space, the lumen, is called the serosa. So it's the outermost layer covering all gastrointestinal tract organs and walls of cavities, not open to the outside of the body. It consists of connective tissue right there. And then above that, you have some simple squamous epithelial cells right here. And its function, remember, this is also the visceral peritoneum. Remember, outside of that, you're going to have the parietal peritoneum. And in between that, you have the peritoneal space. And in that space, these epithelial cells are going to release serous fluid, which is a slippery fluid that helps prevent friction between your abdominal organs. All right, so we're on to the peritoneum. So remember, the tissue that surrounds the heart is from Unit 1 was called the pericardium. The tissue that surrounds the lungs is called the pleura. And the tissue that surrounds your abdominal organs is called the peritoneum. So it's made of three layers. So the most inside or deep layer that's directly on the organ, say the stomach, that's called the visceral peritoneum. So you have a layer of tissue that's directly on the organ, like the small intestine, stomach, liver, whatever. Visceral peritoneum. Superficial or outside of that, you have the parietal peritoneum, parietal layer or the parietal peritoneum. And inside that, between the visceral and the parietal, you have the peritoneal cavity or space. And in that space is where the cells of the serous membrane is going to release serous fluid, and it's very slippery. And that's going to help prevent friction between your abdominal organs. Now, one thing you can see here is like here's the lesser omentum that connects the liver and the stomach. So these structures are not like separate. It's one continuous layer of tissue. So you move down from the lesser omentum past the liver, and hey, now you got the greater omentum, the fatty apron that drapes over the transverse colon and the small intestines. So this is one continuous. The peritoneum is one continuous layer of tissue. All right, so now different parts of the peritoneum. First one's called the greater omentum. We went over this in Unit 1. I don't know if it's in our current lab. That's the fatty apron that's going to drape over the transverse colon, the part of the large intestine that's going horizontally. Also drapes over the small intestines, made of adipose tissue, so that's fat. Contains lymph nodes and macrophages. These are cells that basically engulf cell invaders like, say, bacteria. You also have the lesser omentum. It's the fatty tissue below the liver, and it anchors the liver with the stomach. Also contains macrophages, that part of the immune system. The mesentery, the tissue that binds together the small intestines. So the small intestines aren't just flopping all over everywhere. They're actually connected together with the mesentery. And then you have the mesocolon, and that's what holds the large intestines in place. All right, now the last slide. You have what's called the retroperitoneum or retroperitoneal space, and these are the organs that are not surrounded by the peritoneum. These are located posterior to your abdominal organs, posterior to the peritoneum and the abdominal organs. So there's no membrane on the posterior surface of these organs. On the anterior surface, there's the peritoneum, but on the posterior, there's not. So right here, you have the aorta, the largest vein in the body. So it's got the peritoneum on the front, not on the back. You have the inferior vena cava right here. So that's the part of the vena cava, the largest vein in the body, but inferior means it's below the heart. The duodenum right here. So the front of the duodenum, the first part of the small intestines, has the peritoneum, but the posterior side does not. The pancreas, which would be right here, the kidneys, and the ureters. So the ureters, remember, those are the tubes that go from your kidneys to the urinary bladder. Uh, so the kidneys filter out your blood, form urine, and then urine is transported to your urinary bladder through the ureters. So the retroperitoneum is all the organs that are located posterior or behind the peritoneum. All right, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in lecture number 2.